Hey everybody, this is my TED Talk. I'm going to be speaking on biomarkers as the future of psychiatric assessment and diagnosis. So to begin, I need to define what a biomarker is. Biomarker is actually short for biological marker, and it's essentially any kind of biological indicator of a biological state. So it's any characteristic that can be objectively evaluated or measured as an indicator of an atypical or typical biological process. So for example, the cardiovascular system can be assessed by measuring cholesterol, heart rate, blood pressure. Those are all biomarkers that indicate the health of the cardiovascular system. Another example being the immune system. Biomarkers for the immune system would include inflammation, white blood cell count, lymphocytes. Again, ways that you assess the health of that system, biologically speaking. So in short, a biomarker is any way we physically or medically study the body, and it is objective by nature. So what do biomarkers have to do with psychiatric assessment and diagnosis? Well, before we answer that, we have to look at how disorders are currently being assessed and diagnosed. The current approach is often called the descriptive approach, and in this approach, behaviors are observed. Current language or common language is established to describe those behaviors, and then disorders are defined behaviorally and categorically according to constructs. And this is a pretty good system. It's fairly accurate, and it's given us really everything that we have today as far as our understanding of mental disorders. However, this method does have several pretty big issues. First, it assumes the validity of those constructs. Second, it relies on the reliability and the validity of tools and measurements. Three, it is subjective by nature, especially when it comes to Likert scales. And four, it is highly susceptible to error. There are many folks who are misdiagnosed and many folks who aren't diagnosed at all who perhaps should be. And I posit that we need something more, which brings us back to our question: what do biomarkers have to do with psychiatric assessment and diagnosis? Well, it turns out that many mental disorders, and perhaps most mental disorders, actually do have biomarkers in themselves. And now these biomarkers are much harder to find, they're harder to hone in on, and there's often not a starting place when you're searching for them, but nevertheless they exist. Research is only just now scratching the surface of this new field of study. And when I was kind of digging through and looking for some articles, I found kind of three main areas, three main fields that biomarkers and mental disorders kind of coincide. One of them is epigenetics, one of them is neuroimaging, and one's the gut microbiome. And I don't have time to discuss all the research out there, but just for a few quick examples of what these biomarkers might be. For epigenetics, which is the study of how cells get turned on and off by the environment, one study I saw said that suicide victims with a history of child abuse showed impaired hippocampal RNA expression compared to controls. Another one that had to do with neuroimaging, which is of course any way that you scan or study the brain, found that had a longitudinal study that used MRIs to map the neuroanatomical trajectory of children and adults with persistent ADHD symptoms, found that as the number of adult symptoms increased, so did the rate of cortical thinning in the medial and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So that was a study that used brain imaging to assess kind of the severity of ADHD symptoms. And another area that I mentioned, the gut microbiome, which is the kind of the assessment of the bacterial makeup of the stomach and how it affects functioning. Some research I found in this area had a study that was looking at the fecal bacteria of a control group paired to a group of individuals with major depressive disorder, and it was found that the gut microbiome, the makeup of certain bacteria for the control group, varied very consistently and very differently than those with major depressive disorders. And so none of us, have degrees in neuroscience, or gut microbiome or in epigenetics. But these, the brief review I gave of these research articles, we understand the idea of it, the concept of it, that by peering into the brain and into the gut and into our DNA, we can kind of get an inkling to what kind of mental disorders are presenting themselves. And so really, but a lot of these disorders that I mentioned, they do have biomarkers in the biological body. Of course, hundreds of more examples exist out there too if you want to research them on your own. So what does this mean? Well, it means that biomarkers could potentially be used to predict treatment success for mental disorders, that biomarkers could potentially be used to diagnose the severity of disorders. They could also be used to assess the susceptibility to certain mental disorders. And furthermore, and maybe more importantly, biomarkers can be used to create objective criteria for assessing and categorizing mental disorders. They would essentially function as a new diagnostic tool. So what now? Well, we still need a lot more research to really understand the function that biomarkers could play. This is a really new field of study, and most researchers feel that they've only scratched the surface of the potential use for biomarkers in psychiatric assessment and disorder. However, I posit that the importance of biomarkers really cannot be overstated, because they would function as a dual diagnosis, in that you would be able to subjectively assess a mental disorder and also objectively assess it. And that dual diagnosis would greatly improve the descriptive approach. So in short, biomarkers, I feel, are the future of psychiatric assessment and diagnosis, and that perhaps someday in the future, maybe the near future, some kind of routine physical assessment could be developed that would include all these factors I talked about, and it would greatly reduce the number of people who aren't getting serviced, who need services for mental disorders. So that is my TED Talk.